It's really great privilege and honor to introduce my friend and colleague in matters of Al-Qaeda, Josh Meyer, who was a long-time correspondent for LA Times and shared in a couple of Pulitzers there. Now is the lecturer and director of education and outreach for national security at Medill's Washington program. Josh is going to talk about some of the highlights of his book, which is an incredibly good read. And it's called The Hunt for KSM for people watching on C-SPAN who want to go and buy it right now, please. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Peter. Peter and I actually go way back to, I don't know if we met before 9/11, but we're two of the reporters who were writing about it, I guess, before it was fashionable. I remember back then it was a whole different landscape. It was a lot easier to talk to some people about this. There were people that were very concerned about it. Maybe it was harder to talk to some other people, but I remember that before 9/11, for instance, I was only allowed to use one Abu per story because my editors thought that it would be too confusing. It was actually hard to get some of the stories on the front page. I remember doing one in the summer of 2001 about how Al-Qaeda had changed its focus and appeared to be intent on attacking inside the United States now instead of targets overseas. And my editors, who hopefully won't be listening to this, didn't want to put it on the front page, so I had to call the managing editor. We finally got it on the front page, and 9/11 happened 10, 11 weeks later. So ever since then, I've been following Al-Qaeda and terrorism, much as Peter has. And starting in 2002, I got a tip. We mentioned this in the prologue of the book, that I was in a bar in New York City talking to a bunch of agents who were from the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force there. And in comes the Pent Bomb Squad, which was the investigators for the actual 9/11 plot. And so after talking for hours about everything but terrorism, because they couldn't talk about the investigation, I said, you know, give me a tip, give me something to go on, a lead, a name. And one of them looked around and said, sort of in a stage whisper, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I wrote it on a cocktail napkin and started making calls the next day. And the reason I mention that is because, you know, writing about Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, Peter's book, I can't wait to read, which is coming out, Ayman Zawahiri, all the others, KSM to me always stood out as somebody that was much different than the others. He just seemed much more politically oriented. He just seemed to have a sense of humor. He just seemed like he liked to have a good time. He was just much more fascinating. And while bin Laden and Zawahiri and many of the others stayed in their compound in Afghanistan, KSM was the one who really was traveling around the world, getting things done, doing things, and it just really fascinated me because even, I think it was almost exactly 18 months after 9/11 when he was finally brought to ground. So, you know, I just started thinking in 2002, you know, how did he get away with it for so long, and what was he doing all that time, and even more importantly, who, if anybody, was chasing him, and what were they doing to try to catch him before 9/11? So that was the genesis of the book, and I teamed up with my co-writer at the LA Times, Terry McDermott, to do a very long profile of KSM back in 2002. We were fortunate enough back then, this is before he was caught, obviously, to speak to people who were involved in the chase, to talk to ISI frontline officials and people at the top levels of the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service, to try to get a sense of what was happening. And I've been following the case on and off ever since. So to talk about the book, you know, some of the things that we touch on in the book are how officials at the FBI and the Department of Justice in the years before 9/11 actually undermined the protracted global hunt for KSM, in part because it was too expensive. There was a group of very dedicated officers, agents of the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York who literally chased KSM around the world starting in 1993 after they identified him as one of the financiers of the first World Trade Center attacks. And that quickly led to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the uncle of Abdul Basit al-Karim, otherwise known as Ramzi Youssef. And they started chasing him then. They followed him to the Philippines, to Malaysia, to Qatar, where they almost caught KSM in 1996. They kept chasing him, but somehow or other in the late 90s, he disappeared, went into Afghanistan. And one of the big failures to connect the dots in the 9/11 attacks, which I think we try to articulate in the book, is how did they not make the connection that KSM was part of Al-Qaeda. And Ali Soufan, I know, was here speaking in this forum, and he was one of the people that said we had no idea that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was part of Al-Qaeda until March or April of 2002, when they caught Abu Zubaydah in Pakistan, and he, almost by chance, literally by chance, identified him as Mukhtar, who was a guy they were looking for. But so we tried to go back and tell this as a story. I mean, I, like Peter and others in the audience, have read so many books on terrorism, having covered it as a beat, that the one thing we didn't want to do was foist on the public another tome, I don't want to discredit or criticize the others. They're very important books, but we wanted to just tell a story about the hunt for KSM, the people chasing him, and it wasn't an unintended consequence, but it was through the investigation of that we really were able to, I think, tell also the story of how 9/11 came to be and how people missed it and how they missed the attack. And one of the ways they did that was the FBI people that were chasing KSM in the late 90s really got sideways with their bosses, because they were focusing on what was seen to be a cold case, an isolated case connected to some terrorist plots in Malaysia, in Manila, the Philippines in the mid-90s. Bojinka was a plot to hijack, to blow up 12 airliners in midair as they were flying across the Atlantic to the United States, to kill the Pope, to kill President Clinton. But, by 1998, certainly, even the New York field office was focused on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda so much that KSM sort of fell by the wayside. And we also try to articulate in the book how the CIA, too, had a bin Laden station, but they were not focused on KSM because he wasn't considered to be Al-Qaeda. And the rendition unit that was chasing KSM, or was in charge of his portfolio, didn't have the analytical capabilities that the bin Laden station did. So there's many reasons why KSM was never caught. One of them is just that he himself is an extremely clever, charismatic guy who had as many as 60 aliases and could travel with a network of support that he built. I think one of the most important things that we talk about in the book is that KSM was instrumental in a lot of other things besides 9/11. He helped spearhead an underground railroad of sorts of Al-Qaeda people from Afghanistan back into Pakistan right after 9/11. It was his connections with the jihadi underworld in Pakistan that really helped Al-Qaeda regroup in Pakistan, because, as most of you in this audience knows, bin Laden and many of his core inner circle are Saudis and Egyptians, and it's very hard for them to operate in a place like Pakistan where people speak Urdu. They're at the mercy of their hosts, same as it was in Afghanistan. And so KSM was really a link between them and the Pakistani underworld militant groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and that was how they were able to survive after 9/11. In fact, it was after KSM was captured that they went to the tribal areas because, in part because they just felt like the cities like Karachi were sort of too inhospitable to them at that point. So there's a lot of other, I actually wrote something that's maybe 8 pages, but you don't want to hear all of this. I think the best information comes out during questions. But I think that a lot of the information in the book is character driven. There's a guy, Frank Pellegrino, who was an FBI agent, who I think when he thought that I was, when I was writing a book about this, I think that the people that I was focusing on in the FBI, and also to a lesser degree the CIA, thought that I was going to really drop the hammer on them and really have this be a book that criticized them sharply for what they did. But in reporting it, what we found was that the small group of people that were chasing these guys from 93 on really, in some ways, were true American heroes, in the sense that they were trying to do everything they could to catch them. And they ran into obstacles from within the FBI. They ran into obstacles from the CIA, certainly from the governments of Pakistan and Qatar, who weren't very hospitable or helpful in their requests. So there were a lot of reasons why they didn't catch him. Certainly mistakes were made. Leads weren't followed. I know that these agents in particular have had many, many sleepless nights because they wonder which questions they should have asked that they didn't, or who they should have talked to. So anyway, I hope you read the book. There's a lot of information in there that takes too long to explain now about the creative techniques they used. They followed one guy, Jamal Khalifa, around literally for years in the mid-90s and were able to get a hotel room above and one below his, or an apartment complex, and listen to him for years just to see what he was saying. And I asked them, well, why were you following Jamal Khalifa, not KSM? And they said, well, that's because we didn't know where KSM was. I also said, well, Jamal Khalifa was Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law. How do you not know then that it's an al-Qaeda operation, or that KSM is part of al-Qaeda? And they have a very good answer for that, which would take too long to explain, but it's in the book. Part of it is that, you know, back then there were a lot of different operations that sort of different characters, and bin Laden was only one of them, and so was his organization. And I think that if there's one real takeaway from the book, it would be that, you know, it's not a monolithic organization like al-Qaeda that's really dangerous, although certainly bin Laden, you know, was a force of nature, and, you know, brought together all the groups that became al-Qaeda and was responsible for a lot of plots. But in many ways, it's a guy like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who can sort of come out of nowhere, and he was the one who brought the plot to Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden initially didn't think it was a good idea. KSM was fairly persistent, and then he kept an independence from al-Qaeda. He refused to swear an oath of allegiance or bayat to al-Qaeda until after 9/11, I believe it was, because he wanted the independents to do the plot his way, and to bring it somewhere else if he thought that al-Qaeda wasn't going to have the, you know, the backbone to do it, I guess is the best way to put it. So in many ways, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, I don't think, gets the credit that he deserves as, you know, the single most deadly terrorist of our times in terms of actually personally being responsible for executing attacks. So I think that with that, it's probably best to...
Let's drill down a little bit on the question of KSM's sort of involvement in 9/11 versus bin Laden's, because you say that bin Laden said it was not a good idea. I think by that you mean that the tactics that KSM was suggesting weren't exactly right, but I mean, bin Laden, I think, strategically wanted to attack on the United States, right?
Right. And I think that, you know, these two guys had very big egos, and there's a lot of, I think that there was a lot of sizing each other up. I remember many people telling me that that KSM wasn't even sure that he wanted to work with bin Laden, and that it was only after the embassy bombings in Africa in 1998 that he said, you know, I'm going to try this again, and I think that you know, that we can work together. But I don't think, and I think KSM has even said this in Guantanamo, I don't think he ever thought that he worked for bin Laden. I think he worked with him, and that they were sort of, he was an independent contractor. But yes, bin Laden played some role in it. I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed initially wanted 10 planes attacked, and bin Laden said that you know, it should be more manageable. There's some parts in the book, and also I wrote some stories at the LA Times about this, where it was one of the most read stories I wrote in terms of people passing it along, was that KSM thought bin Laden was a really bad boss. I think I might have made the reference to a Dilbert cartoon, because bin Laden was meddling in certain things. He wanted the plot moved up to the summer of 2001, and KSM said, you know, it's not ready yet, and we want to wait until September, because his on-the-ground commander, Mohammed Atta, thought that we should wait till Congress is back in session.
And he wanted to move the plot up because Ariel Sharon was visiting D.C. at that time?
I think so, yeah. But so there was a lot of pushing back and forth, and I think the bottom line is that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed thought that the plot just wasn't ready. I mean, and he was, like any good manager, was relying on he was good at delegating responsibility, and in that case, he just was relying on Mohammed Atta, who was giving him instruction.
Now, Yosri Fuda was able to find KSM a year before the CIA was. How did that happen, and why did the CIA take so long to find him, relatively speaking? And a sort of, Ron Susskind has a story which I'd like to get your take on, which is that Yosri Fuda worked for Al Jazeera, which is owned by the Qatari royal family. And Susskind has a vivid story of the Emir of Qatar calling George Tenet to say, you know, by the way, this guy is here. Well, let's start with that. Is that story true?
I think it is in many respects. There's other things that our book differs from Tenet's book in. I'll just leave it at that. But I think that we were able to get a broader picture by talking to a larger set of people than the CIA. But
well, just to drill down on that. So the owner of Al Jazeera calls the CIA director to tell him, I have a reporter of mine has done an interview with KSM, and I'm giving you information about where he is. That story is true?
It's the broad outlines of that are true, I believe. You know, I've never talked to Yosri about that, so.
Well, Yosri says he doesn't know.
Right. My understanding is that it was done without his knowledge because Yosri is a very.
Well, of course, it would be not only incredibly dangerous for any Al Jazeera reporter if that was the case, and it would be incredibly damaging to Al Jazeera's reputation as an independent.
Right. Right. I think that the information was conveyed somehow. It's not clear whether it was done in a meeting, personal meeting, but and I do know that's what I was starting to say is that Yosri is a very ethical reporter, and I don't think that he would do that. But somehow or other, the information was conveyed, and that it ultimately got to the CIA. But you raised a very important question, which is how did Yosri find Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? And that's not what happened. It was actually the other way around. That Khalid Sheikh Mohammed sent out, basically invited Yosri to Karachi to meet with him, and he was taken on a very circuitous route, and all of a sudden he's you know, opens the door, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibr are there, and he spent 2 days with them, interviewing them, and that just goes to show, to me, a couple of things. One, you know, how egotistical Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is, but also how brazen he was in Karachi. I mean, we talked to somebody who was familiar with that incident who said that KSM literally walked the reporter down the stairs of the flat and out onto the street when he left. And you know, one thing that I will always remember that a senior ISI person told me back in 2002 was that the ISI has Pakistan so well covered that you can't smoke a cigarette on any street corner in Pakistan without us knowing what brand it is. And I always remember that because if that's the case, then why couldn't you find these guys, which raises a lot of questions.
I think that's overstating ISI's capabilities.
Yeah.
But not that they don't have capabilities, but it took the CIA 10 years to find bin Laden, and they have some capabilities too.
Yeah.
Frank Pellegrino is the KSM case agent who's sort of one of the key characters in the book.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about him, and tell us also, I mean, here is one of the leading experts on KSM who wasn't allowed to speak to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for many, many, many years, even though he was in American custody. How did that happen? And what were and was that a good idea?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think that he was one of the most compelling figures for me in this whole thing. I mean, he's almost a figure of Shakespearean tragedy type proportions. He was a very idiosyncratic agent who had been an accountant, decided to join the Bureau, got his law degree in his early years, and then was one of the guys who was asked to help out on the first World Trade Center investigation. And because he was fairly new, he got assigned to follow a guy named Rashid, who, you know, they didn't think was important at the time, but he turned out to be Ramzi Youssef. And so he started following KSM in '93. But to sort of fast forward to get to the point, you know, Frank is a very, very good agent. He's a very dogged agent. Everybody always described him to me as saying, well, you got to talk to Frank, you know, and I'd say, well, you know, describe him for me. And they said, well, he's about as un-FBI agent as you can get. And everybody who said that, I would say, well, why is that? And they said, well, you just have to know Frank. But you know, he bucked authority. He actually got in a lot of yelling matches, as we say in the book, with John O'Neill, the guy who was essentially lionized and made almost into a hero for his single-handed pursuit of bin Laden. But you know, as we say, that his tunnel vision on bin Laden and al-Qaeda in the late 90s made it very hard for Frank Pellegrino and his partner to pursue their investigation into Khalid Sheikh Mohammed all that time, because he wasn't considered to be al-Qaeda. But after 9/11, Frank was in Malaysia at the time, and we have a scene where he's talking to his former partner, and they knew immediately that it was an al-Qaeda attack, they said, and he wanted to join in the hunt. He was doing some counterterrorism work then, but he wasn't allowed to pursue, to join in the specific investigation into Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And even more frustratingly, after KSM was caught, he tells his wife, you know, they're going to really need me. He was summoned to headquarters in Washington. He drives down there, and they didn't use him in the interrogation of KSM. They also didn't use him in some of the efforts to mine the information that KSM had. I mean, we have a scene where he's in the basement of the FBI building weeks after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is caught, and he's going through, Xerox, pieces of paper of pocket litter, what they found in KSM's pockets and emails and so forth. And another agent says, Frank, what are you doing here? You should be out on the front lines, interrogating this guy. But I think that speaks volumes.
Just to clarify, I mean, he wasn't allowed to interrogate KSM because the FBI wouldn't allow any FBI agents to interrogate.
Well, I was just getting to that. I mean, that speaks to the larger problem, which was that the FBI and the CIA were at such, odds with each other that the FBI effectively took itself out of the interrogation regime because they didn't think that, this story has been very well told, but they thought that they were using methods that were bordering on torture, as Ali Soufan said. And so the FBI wouldn't let its agents allowed into these interrogations. But also I think the CIA went out of their way to try to do it themselves anyway, so that there was a lot of tension and conflict between the two agencies. So the FBI, to a large degree, didn't play a role in any of the interrogations of these guys. And I think that there were people at the highest levels of the FBI that were saying, this is crazy, this guy here literally logged 400,000 miles, building a criminal indictment against KSM. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of him. You need to let him in the room with KSM when he's being interrogated.
Did that ever happen eventually?
It happened finally in 2007, after KSM and the others were brought to Guantanamo. And because of some adverse court opinions and other information, the Bush administration said, well, we really need to do something here. We're probably going to have to build some sort of case against them. So they sent in these FBI, these clean teams, FBI agents and criminal investigative task force agents to essentially rebuild the cases. And I think that that's very important because that's one of the building blocks, if not the building block, for the case that's going to be going forward now in Guantanamo. Frank and other agents were able to interview KSM and Hambali and others down in Guantanamo. And there are some great scenes, if I may say so, in the book about how Frank finally gets to face off against his nemesis, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, in 2007. And, obviously he's got a lot of strong feelings for Mohammed, but he started by being very friendly and open because as the traditional FBI way of building rapport with your target, you want to be nice to them so they can talk to you. And so Pellegrino explained to KSM, I was the guy who was chasing you in Pakistan, and I was the guy chasing you in Qatar and in the Philippines. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed looks at him and he says, so you were the one. And he even told Pellegrino that when they almost caught him in Qatar in 1996, that KSM even knew which hotel Pellegrino was staying in. So he relayed to somebody when he left that interview that it was sort of chills going down his spine, that he sort of felt like he had been the hunted instead of the hunter. So,
to what extent did the Bureau cooperate with the book? And is Pellegrino still in the Bureau?
Frank is still in the Bureau, yeah. I would say that, there were times when I actually said to certain people at the FBI, do you really want the front page of the first page of the book to say this is the book the FBI didn't want you to read? Because part of it is institutional bureaucratic inertia. Some of it's institutional resistance to talking to the press. But I would not say that the Bureau was overly forthcoming in talking to us about it. In the end, we were able to get, and also I think part of it is they were very, very concerned that the people involved in the investigation, not compromise anything that could impact the prosecution in Guantanamo or in the civilian court of these guys. I would only add, and I don't mean, actually I do mean to speak cryptically, that you'd have to read the book to see who we ultimately talked to, and I think we were successful in getting the story.
How useful was WikiLeaks for you in building up the story of KSM and post 9/11? Because it seems that there was a lot of material in there about KSM and his network in Karachi.
Yeah. A lot of the, and again, I have to be careful about this. Those documents are a really valuable trove of information. Some of that stuff can be obtained elsewhere through talking to people and things, but no, it was fortuitous that those documents had been released, I think. I think that they really helped show a picture of what was going on at the time. Part of it, I think, was just, the hard part is getting all the different sides of a story, the CIA version, the FBI version, the Pakistani version, and I can tell you, and you, I'm sure you know this as well or better than I do, that especially when you're talking about something that happened in Pakistan, there's usually 15 different versions of what happened, including the capture of KSM, I think.
Well, final question, what happened with the capture of KSM? How did that happen? How did that go down without giving away too much of the book?
You know, I think part of it is a success story of the CIA. I think by that time, the FBI and the CIA were so much in conflict with each other that they were virtually not working together. In fact, if you talk to the FBI, they'll say that they played no role in the final capture of KSM.
On this issue, or just writ large at the time?
Well, basically, there were a few people. A lot of this is personality driven. There was a CIA station chief, and again, this is in the book, a CIA station chief in Pakistan, Robert Grenier, and an FBI assistant legal attaché who got along very well, and they worked well together. But once those two left, and the hunt for KSM was really heating up, it's sort of unfortunate because they happened at the same time in the summer of 2002. The relationship really degraded to the point where the FBI believes that the CIA wasn't even looking in the right places or talking to people like KSM's nephew, or looking for KSM's nephew in a way that would have led to KSM back then. But in terms of the final capture of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, I think part of it is that they developed an informant who was very helpful in being able to be inserted into KSM's inner circle, and he led them to them. But it's, as with everything else, it's a lot more complicated than that. We go into some detail in the book about how they were using tracking, sort of NSA type listening devices. KSM was using a particular kind of cell phone chip that I think he thought was secure, but it turns out that it wasn't.
This is the Swiss cell phone chips. Why did they think these were secure?
Because the way they were purchased was in bulk, and you don't have to like give your name to it. So it's, I think KSM was a fanatic about operational security, and that's one of the reasons he was able to stay on the lam for so long. But I think that they thought that if there was no way you could trace the actual purchase of the chip back to somebody, that if you only used it sparingly, you would be able to avoid capture. I remember Yassir Fuda, for instance. I think he said that as soon as he came in to meet with KSM and Ramzi Ben Al-Shib, that they took the battery out of his cell phone and the SIM card and so forth. So I believe that it was just good detective work, and I think the Swiss and the Germans and others helped on that. So you had an informant, you had some electronic eavesdropping. I think the Pakistanis helped to a degree. So it was a combination of figures. But in the end, and I think this is where our book differs from the George Tenet book, I think Tenet says that KSM grabbed a rifle and started shooting. And everybody that I've talked to, at least the version of events that we came to believe is true, is that KSM was just captured in his sleep. And that's one of the reasons why he looked so groggy in that photo.
That was like the one really great piece of public diplomacy that the United States has ever done, the perp photo.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, that photo actually caused me a lot of I don't know if heartburn's the word, but there was a lot of, as with again everything else that happens in Pakistan, we spend an inordinate amount of time tracking down whether KSM was actually captured somewhere else and then brought to that house, because
What did you conclude?
Well, I mean, he was captured in one. I think he was captured where the official version says he was, but Christina Lamb, who's a very good reporter, did a great story back then about how she was taken through that house by the guy's mother, Abdul Qudus, and she said there's no wall in this house that looks like the wall behind the one where he was photographed. So how could he have been captured here? And I think as we say in the book, the photo was taken later when he was in a safe house, when they didn't, they wanted to sort of muss up his appearance and take a photo of him that was less flattering than some of the other ones. So, I think it's, Robert Mueller, the FBI director, once said about 9/11, he said, this is one of those things where we're probably going to be finding out important pieces of information 30 years from now. I mean, it's just, you think you know the whole story, and it's going to take a really long time to find out everything. So I don't think we answered all the questions, but I think we answered the basic ones. So, I mean, I'm still very curious as to how Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was able to operate in Karachi starting in, I think, 1990 or maybe 1991, certainly through 93, and then go back and forth from Karachi to wherever he was going without, anybody finding out where he was.
Great. Well, let's throw it open to questions. If you have a question, please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. We'll start over here in the back.
Yes, John Mueller from Ohio State and the Cato Institute. You talked a bit about the plot on Clinton and the Pope. Besides 9/11, could you give some sketch of what terrorism was carried out by KSM? Were any of them, did they reach fruition, and were they successful?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I think even in the paper 2 days ago, the Sajid Badat case, who was the other shoe bomber with Richard Reed, he just testified in court in New York and was talking about how he and Richard Reed were working directly for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Right. No, in terms of, he was involved in an extraordinary number of plots. He was very creative. A lot of them, and I hate to keep referring to it, but we go into great detail in the book about which plots worked, which didn't, but also about his mindset. I mean, he was literally like coming up with plots all the time, and some would work, some wouldn't. I think one of his biggest, I hate to use the word contribution because that's positive, but one of the most important things he did was help set up terrorism cells, here and there. I mean, he was instrumental in helping Jamaat Islamiyah in Southeast Asia come into the Al-Qaeda fold, or at least have a nexus with them. I think he helped finance the Bali bombings. He certainly had a direct role in the Jerba, Tunisia bombings, in which I think 20 people were killed. It was a synagogue off the coast of Tunisia. I think that there was a lot of information we had that he was directly, or some of his lieutenants were involved in the Saudi Arabia bombings in 2003, where I think Peter and I had a nice lunch one day in one of the royal family's big dining halls. We were both there after they remember the attacks, and at that time we didn't know. We just knew it was Al Qaeda. But later, just in the reporting of this book, we came to realize that I think it was Mansour Jabara. One of the names run together, but that some of the people that had been working for KSM were involved in those plots. So I think that there were a tremendous amount of them. The plot against the Pope and against President Clinton, it's hard to tell how close to fruition they were. I do know that when they searched the room where they were plotting all of this, which caught fire serendipitously for law enforcement, they found papal robes and other things that indicated that they were at least trying to get close. It was also, they had picked an apartment that was on the route that the motorcade would go through. So, they were certainly fairly, what's the word? Eager to try to do this. So,
Josh, what do you assess KSM's motivations to be?
I think that that's one of the most fascinating things about the upcoming trial, if and when it happens, is how eager KSM is to tell the world what his motivations are. And I think that that's one reason in the book we have the transcript, verbatim transcript at the back of his very long soliloquy at Guantanamo in 2008 is, to me, he was much more political than bin Laden. I know you literally wrote the book on bin Laden, and I think...
But political in a sort of secular,
right,
national Israeli anti-Zionist.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, bin Laden had political issues too, but I think that KSM is a much more secular guy. I think he is not what you would call a radical, fire-breathing fundamentalist. When he was in the Philippines, there's a lot of stories that he would hang out in karaoke bars and...
Do you think those are accurate?
Well, I was just going to get to that. It's hard to tell if he was using that as part of his cover or whether he really enjoyed himself. I talked to one person who said that all the times he was in the Philippines, he drank Buckler beer, which is a non-alcoholic beer. But whatever, he was enthusiastically pursuing that persona. And one of the most fascinating things that we got was that one of the ways they tracked KSM to Qatar was that he really liked one of the bar girls in the Philippines, and so he would send her letters and cards and things. And he sent her a Christmas card, I think it was one year. And so the two FBI agents, Frank Pellegrino and his buddy, who was a Port Authority detective, Matthew Bashir, they'd go back and forth and do a lot of dogged police work, and they would talk to the bar girls and their families. And one day they were talking to the mother of one of the bar girls, and she said, well, I have some letters from, to my daughter, and one of them, a couple of them were from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. One was a card, and the return address was whited out, and so they sent it to an FBI lab, and sure enough, the return address was the Ministry of Water and Electricity, I believe, in Qatar. So that's one of the ways they found him. So, he liked women enough to certainly pursue that kind of thing. So, but it's, I think it's part of what a complex character he is. When they caught Ramzi bin al-Shib, or bin Sheba, however you pronounce it, in 2002, they found a suitcase with a lot of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's belongings in it, and they found photos in there of him playing with his kids that seemed to be very recent. So all the while he's this terrorist mastermind, he did try to make time to have playtime with his children, and I think he's sort of a ball of contradictions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, tell everybody the nearest point at which and maybe if KSM had been found, arrested in Qatar, maybe 9/11 would have turned out very differently. So, what happened there?
Well, I personally believe that 9/11 would have never happened if KSM had been caught there. I mean, clearly Al Qaeda would have had other plots and attacks, but this was KSM's baby. This was his plot that came out of the attacks, or the plots in Manila, and there was good work by the FBI and the CIA that led them to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was working for the Ministry of Water and Electricity in Qatar. One of the members of the royal family in Qatar had sort of I don't know if it's a guaranteed employment program, but he had brought a lot of the mujahideen over to Qatar and let them hang out on a farm just because he thought that they were, an important service to the Islamic world. KSM was one of them, but he clearly was using his job as a bureaucrat there as a cover, and was traveling around the world. And so the FBI very much wanted to get him when they were there. We have a letter from FBI Director Louis Freeh at the time, who was emailing the Qatar government, writing the Qatar government and saying, you have a very, very dangerous terrorist there. We want to come in and get him, and we need your cooperation. And so, as we say in the book, there was a lot of back and forth. It went up to the deputies meeting of the National Security Council, and ultimately, instead of doing a snatch and grab, or even pushing him out, or they were trying to find a way to get him to fly out of the country so they could grab him in another country. And that they were working on that, but ultimately the U.S. government decided to go through the front door and ask the Qatar government for permission to get him, and a lot of people warned them that that wasn't a good idea, and it turns out that it wasn't. That while Frank Pellegrino and some other agents were on the ground in Pakistan, in Qatar, trying to get KSM, he slipped out the back door.
And he was tipped off.
Yeah.
Gentleman in the back here.
Hi, Adam Zagarin, the Project on Government Oversight. Excuse me. We've got a book coming out in the very near future by Jose Rodriguez, talking about the utility of various interrogation techniques. Mr. Rodriguez was associated with the CIA interrogation of detainees, including, I believe, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, not that he was personally there. What do we know about the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? Obviously, the book is about the hunt, not the. But what do we know about the interrogation, if anything, or what are the indications? Where did it take place? Did it save many lives and warn us about future attacks, or what was the utility of that exercise?
I would say that our book and I haven't read his book, although I do love the title, Hard Measures. But I would say that our book differs significantly than his on that. We did focus primarily on the hunt, but we do go into some detail about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's time in custody. And I think that if you talk to some of the people that were involved in this, there's a feeling that that he was very practiced in the art of counterintelligence and counterinterrogation, and that he was very good at knowing the limits of waterboarding and other tactics, and that he provided them with a tremendous amount of disinformation. I mean, I think he provided them with a lot of information, But if you really look at it, the attacks that followed shortly after that, the attacks in Saudi Arabia were in May 2003, which is right after he was captured. You had other attacks that followed shortly that are after that, and even in the years after that, that were linked to people that worked closely with KSM. So you'd have to think that he knew about those attacks, and if he did say anything about them, nobody's told me that, and it certainly didn't lead to them stopping those plots. It also didn't lead to the capture of bin Laden or Ayman Zawahiri, his number two. We weren't the first to report this, but we were able to confirm that that KSM did meet with Zawahiri the day before he was captured. So he clearly knew where bin Laden and Zawahiri were, and I think perhaps most importantly, the courier that ultimately led to bin Laden, al-Kuwaiti, his full name escapes me now, was one of the guys that was working very closely with KSM back then. I'll have to read Peter's book to see if, yeah, I believe he was one of KSM's proteges.
Right.
You know, so I think that all of that information certainly KSM had in his head, and everything that I understand about it, you know, whether it's, you know, being privy to what was in the cables that were coming back about the interrogations and people that were involved in it, was that he did not give up that kind of information. So. So I don't know how successful it was.
If we contrast what you just said with the latter phase, if we contrast what you've just said with the latter phase that began in 2007 when they brought in Frank Pellegrino to do the clean team cleanup to produce evidence that might be useful in a legal prosecution conducted by this country. Of course, by then, all the attacks and the this and the that that you had described had already happened, so that wasn't going to be stopped. But what about the clean team exercise? I mean, he stopped obfuscating to some extent at that point, as far as we know, or what happened then?
Well, you know, whether they got, and again, like in terms of operational intelligence and whether you can use it to stop plots. I mean, I think that like talking to somebody in 2007 after they've been in custody since 2003, I think it's negligible what you're going to get from them. I think at that point they were just trying to build a case against him. But I think one of the things that's most important, a point we tried to make in the book, that I think is frequently ignored is that it's not just the type of interrogation methods you're using, it's who's doing the interrogating. I mean, what never seemed to make sense to me, and I know Ali Soufan and a lot of other FBI agents have been screaming about this for years, is even if the CIA brought in these contract interrogators to do these interrogations, they had absolutely no background knowledge of Al-Qaeda or who the players were. And you know, when the FBI interrogates somebody, they know everybody who's in your network, who your, you know, what your backstory is, how the various parts work together, and you need that information so that when somebody gives you an answer, you can tell if they're lying or not, or you can tell them what question to ask. And so what they think is that even if the waterboarding and the other methods that they were using on KSM worked, they didn't know what questions to ask. And you know,
yeah, Ali Soufan describes that as the "tell me what I want to know"
right.
sort of school of interrogation.
Right, and you know, I heard from a lot of people that they would just come in and they would repeat the same question over and over, and that it was actually like, well, you know what we want.
Yeah.
And you know, they'd be like, no, actually I don't. So to me, and as we say in the book, there were 3 different organizations that were desperately trying. They were reading the cables coming back when KSM was being interrogated, and they were saying either he's making this stuff up or you're not asking the right questions. And that was the 9/11 Commission, which by then was already investigating this, who had some very smart and you know, experienced people on that. It was the Criminal Investigative Task Force at Guantanamo who was reading the traffic and saying, you know, you got to ask him this. And for some reason now, I'm forgetting what the third one was. It was either the FBI or whatever. But these 3, you know, entities were saying, look, you know, you're not getting the right information out of him. You need to ask better questions. and the people that I spoke to said that they weren't getting that even after that they weren't getting the right information out of him. So,
David Isby.
Hi, David Isby. You've just said something which I found rather disturbing. A guy like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed can come out of nowhere. Now, bin Laden's dead, and the middle ranks of al-Qaeda have been decimated by the predators, but I know the subcontinent is full of lots of smart entrepreneurial guys, and groups with their roots there have, through Bombay and the Times Square bombing, shown a transnational reach. Where is the next threat coming? Is someone like KSM likely to come up with one of these groups, and how can we identify or prevent such a threat?
That's a great question, David. I think one of the most intriguing people that I've focused on since I think 2006, and at the time I didn't even know this, was one of KSM's proteges. It's a guy named Adnan El-Shukr Juma. And I didn't even know this at the time, but you know, KSM really liked people that he thought could function in three worlds: the Arab world, the South Asia world, and the Western world. Like, you know, and Shukr Juma, like KSM, spoke Urdu, he spoke Arabic, and he spoke English, and he, you know, spent time in the United States. And I think that
He's an American citizen.
yeah. So I think that he, I think people like that. I forget if he's a citizen or he's a national.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
I
pretty
believe
sure
he's a citizen,
I mean,
yeah.
because he grew up in the Bronx in Florida.
Yeah. But he was born in Saudi Arabia too, so that's right. I forget my own reporting on that. I spent like 3 weeks in Miami writing about him back in 2006. But I think that, you know, there's a lot of people that are still out there that they worry about, that were either trained by people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or others. But you don't need training like that. You can just sort of come out of nowhere on your own or from the internet. I think that the Mumbai attacks, for instance, are extremely disconcerting about that. I do think that somebody like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed doesn't come along all that often, thankfully. You know, somebody who's got the sort of, you know, sort of obsession with attacking the United States in very creative and new ways. But I think that it is scary, because I don't know if you know, they could be from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or it could be somebody like Nidal Hassan in Texas, who just gets radicalized on the internet.
Isn't there a big difference now? I mean, there were 16 people on the no-fly list on 9/11. Now there are 21,000. Right. We've got TSA, DHS,
Yeah.
all these joint terrorism task forces. I mean, there's a huge amount of intellectual and
Yeah.
financial effort put at trying to sort of
Yeah.
look at this question.
Yeah.
I mean, we had KSM, presumably, well, it did take a while even after 9/11 to find him, but
Yeah.
it seems implausible that there would be somebody who had a big network that wasn't sort of on the radar
Right.
of some American.
Yeah. Well, I think that Al-Qaeda would like to call these spectaculars. I think it's harder to do one of those now, certainly in the United States. But you can also do a lot of damage as an individual doing some kind of attack. I mean, I remember right after 9/11, I got a call from somebody saying that if you took out a chlorine tank in the United States with a rocket-propelled grenade, you could kill, you know, a lot of people, sort of like a Bhopal disaster in India. And
But the interesting thing is it's never happened.
Right. And I remember thinking, do I even want to write that story, because I don't want to give people a good idea. And I remember saying, I'm going to think about it more in the
Well,
morning.
now you've just told an audience of several 100,000 on
Right.
C-SPAN. So, okay.
But the Wall Street Journal did that story like the very next day back in 2002. So I was like, well, I don't have to worry about that ethical issue now. Good.
This lady in front.
My name's Li Yang. Just wonder, you know, the FBI, CIA, they search everywhere. Even people are innocent, and so they will arrest or maybe sent to the Guantanamo Bay while they take people's resources away. Why can't they stop all those Al-Qaeda or KSM, their activities right from the beginning? And is there anything FBI or CIA, they try to hide all this stuff? And how do they really hate American or any country they want to fight against? And how soon really do they know whether Al-Qaeda planned as Osama bin Laden to Pakistan, they hide out? I don't know why they cannot find out that, instead of why all these years of war.
Okay. Thanks for the
Well, I think why couldn't they find out that these guys were planning the attacks? I mean, I think there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on that. And I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to write the book. I think that's why Peter wrote The Longest War. I mean, I think that history is, the history of this is not finished. I think that the 9/11 Commission did a great report, but that was in 2004. And I think that the people that wrote that will be the first to admit that they didn't have access to certain documents and certain officials, and that the history changes. So I think we're still trying to find that out. But I think that people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed fell through the cracks, and that some of the problems that were in place back then are still there now.
What happens with KSM on May 5th at Guantanamo? And will you be involved in covering any of that?
Yeah, I'm hoping to. There's 60 spots down there for journalists, and I think that there's 800 people that are applying or so forth. But yes, I certainly plan to follow it, whether I'm there in spirit or in
And they're also
physical
hooking
presence.
it up at Fort Meade?
They're in Fort Meade, yeah. I've talked to some people recently that have said that that we need as much transparency for this trial as we can. I mean, this is our Nuremberg trial, and this is our way to sort of have a fitting end to the 9/11 era and really put in the public record, what happened. I think that because the government really has never done that, where they've done a formal sort of document dump of everything they know about 9/11. And I think that the American public is waiting for that and deserves that. I was at the LA Times for 20 years, and one of the cases I covered was O.J. Simpson. And what I like to tell people is if that was the trial of the century, last century, and you could have every minute of it televised, I mean, there are some complications about televising this trial with all the national security issues, but you could do it on a delay and have a mechanism in place so that you give the public a view of what happened in the trial and what happened in 9/11 in a way that doesn't compromise national security. I mean, I'd love to see that. I don't think it's going to happen.
Should the trial have happened in the Southern District of New York, where the crimes happened?
Well, as a reporter, I try to be objective about that. But
Okay, but you've just written a book, so we're
right.
asking you a question.
Yes, I do. That's true. Somebody told me I've been promoted. But no, I think so. I mean, I was there in the summer of 2001 when the embassy bombings trials were taking place. I just wrote an op-ed piece, which is, I forgot how torturous it is to get an op-ed piece published. But the op-ed piece says, it goes into detail about how when I was there in 2001 watching the embassy bombings trial, they brought in witnesses from Nairobi and from the two sites where the embassies were attacked. They brought in the victims' families. They brought in tons of witnesses. They introduced mountains of information. And there were people in the courtroom to point to them and say, from the witness stand and say, those are the guys that I saw at the site. And I think at the end of that, you really had a sense that justice was done. And I don't know if you're going to get that in
To follow up on that, any national security information, did any national security information come out of the trial that was not supposed to?
No, I mean, and as you know.
And what were the sentences of the people involved?
I think it was like 240 years each,
right.
Something like that.
So,
and you really had and you got to hear from the terrorists themselves about why they did it, but I think some people are afraid that if KSM is going to use the trial to sort of, I hate to use the term hijack the trial, but that he's going to use the trial to like tell people why he did it. I was inadvertent. But I don't know if that's a bad thing, having the American public hear what he's saying. I think that people are smart enough. People are smart enough to know how self-serving it is, and I think that by keeping him, and we say this in the book, that by hiding him for so long and refusing to bring him out into the light, you almost give him much more of what he wants, which is like a mythical persona. And I personally think that now that I'm allowed to give my opinion, that the absolute worst thing you can do is execute these guys, because that they will then become the martyrs that they're trying to become.
What's really interesting, though, is, and we always say that, but I don't think it's true. Mm-hmm. Is Bin Laden a big martyr right now? I mean, we essentially a non-judicial execuation by the U.S. Navy SEALs. It hasn't happened. I can't think of the only martyr for the movement that I can think of is Sheikh Rahman. Yeah. Who's big, but when it's one of these people who are more on the fighting side rather than the religious side, they don't seem to live on as martyrs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are some people who will look at bin Laden's death as sort of a cause for, you know, continuing the jihad. I mean, I would ask most people if you know what's up with Ramzi Youssef, and I think that, you know, he's been locked away in the prison in you know,
Florence.
Supermax in Colorado for so long that I think he's just disappeared from the public consciousness, you know.
Completely.
And,
It's a bit like being buried alive.
yeah, somebody told me that they went to visit Ramsey and Supermax and said, "Hey, Frank Pellegrino says hello," and he was like, "Hey, tell Frank I said hi." So you know, because you know these agents spent so much time with them in court and elsewhere that they you know, they really got to know them, and I think that's important, that you know your enemy, not just keep them, you know, at a 30,000-foot distance.
Other questions? This gentleman over here.
Just a detail, do you know if it's true that he was waterboarded 140 times? And if it is true, how could he survive such a treatment?
Well, I think the official number is 183.
180. Okay.
And that it happened over a period of a month, which, if you do the math, that's... But, you know, one thing that I don't think the public really is aware of is what does that mean? I mean, like, if you're lying down and they pour water on you like 4 times in one session, is that 4 water boards or is that 1 water board? But I think the bottom line is that, and we have a scene in the book about this, about how KSM is like ticking off his fingers as they're waterboarding him because he knows it's going to stop at like a certain point. I mean, I think that that's a good thing that the United States, whatever you think of waterboarding, was that they were applying the technique so carefully that somebody like KSM could know that they could only take it to a certain point.
Was that like after the 182nd time, or?
I think maybe the 30th time or so. But, you know, I mean, if you waterboard somebody any more than 20 or 30 times, or I think they're probably going to, maybe they're going to get a sense that, you know, that they're not going to die at the end of it. You know, but who knows? I mean, I was not there in the room. But, you know, it's a very controversial tactic. Personally, I think that one of the most debilitating tactics that you can use against people is sleep deprivation. I don't know anybody who's like not been allowed to sleep for 3 days, but you know, I saw some video of KSM being interrogated after 2 or 3 days after he was captured, and even then he couldn't keep his head up. I mean, and he was just mumbling gibberish, and I mean, it's very,
And he
very
was actually
debilitating.
kept up for 6.5 days straight, I think.
Yeah, well, the CIA has some formula that you're allowed to be up for like 11 days or something. I mean, they have people that are being paid a lot of money to figure out that it's 11 days, not 12 days, or I forget the exact number, but there is a number that you're supposed to stop right there and give him a pillow, I guess, and let him go to sleep.
What was your, Terry McDermott, your co-author, and your own assessment of the extent to which the Pakistanis helped with the arrest or capture of KSM?
You mean with the hunt for him, or the very final steps?
Both.
You know, that, you know, having been in Pakistan in 2002, I know that, just to take a step back, I think that one of the things about writing a book that's different than writing news stories is that the more you report something, the more the black and white issues become gray, and you know, there's a lot of nuances and complications. And one thing that we found is that you cannot say that the Pakistan government was working in league with the militant groups, and that even though there are elements within the ISI, certainly that our liaisons to these groups, and in a sense helped create and train and fund them with our help back when we were fighting the Soviets, or you know, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. I think what we found was that there were a core of very dedicated Pakistanis who were working really hard to work with the United States to catch these guys. I mean, we have a couple of what I think are some of the best scenes in the book where this Port Authority cop died in 9/11, and they brought his handcuffs with his, they were engraved with his name Mac on them, and they brought them to Pakistan at his widow's request, and she said, use these on the bad guys. And some of the Pakistanis really came to look at those handcuffs as sort of a talisman of good luck, and they knew that the guy had a daughter who was born after he died, and so it became personal to them that they were helping find the people who did this. And I think that, so there's scenes like that where You know, there were a lot of people that were trying very hard. I mean, there's one colonel who we talk about in the book, who was extremely instrumental in working with the Americans to catch these guys, and they even brought him back to the United States and brought him to Police Week, where the cops like spent a couple days getting really drunk. And
was he working for the Intelligence Bureau or ISI?
he was working for the. I mean, the ISI has different branches. I mean, they have a certain branch that deals with the external threat and the internal threat, as you know. And there is one branch that's essentially dedicated to being the handlers of some of the sectarian groups. But these guys were sort of the local authority, sort of like the local police version of it, I guess. You know, who were much more. They were in a different section of the ISI.
So your assessment, just to summarize, is that the Pakistanis were quite helpful in the KSM matter.
Some of them were, but you know, and there's many instances in the book where even this one Colonel Tarek, for instance, would work very closely with the FBI, for instance. But whenever they would go to a scene for a raid, it would be empty. So, you know, the question was, you know, even if Colonel Tarek was helping, when he telegraphed to other people that he was working with that we're going to do this, you know, were other people more effective at being unhelpful than he was at being helpful. So it's complicated, I guess is the best way to put it.
Other questions?
Well, we've stumped everybody.
Huma Imtiaz?
Just very quickly, in 2006 or so, I mean, after KSM got captured, I spoke to some police officials who said that KSM was instrumental in training members of Jundullah, the Pakistani version, which were also responsible in the early 2000s for attacks on the Corps Commander, bomb blasts in Karachi. So at what point did the Pakistani authorities figure out that KSM was responsible for those attacks, or did it come out much later after he was captured? And the second question is, this is all conjecture, but did KSM actually orchestrate the wedding of his nephew to Afia Siddiqui or not?
Did he orchestrate the wedding or officiate at?
Well, I mean, officiate, or was he the one who told his nephew to marry Afia? Was Afia the one, did he ask Afia to marry his nephew? Is there anything in your book that says something about that?
You know, the Jundullah thing was something, there was a lot of blind alleys I mean, the way Terry and I split it up was I dealt with, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but I dealt with the law enforcement and the intelligence. Terry dealt with a lot of the KSM and his family. But I also looked into the Jundullah thing, and it's just such a and also like Jamaat Islami, the political party in Pakistan, and whether they have a network of safe houses that have helped Al Qaeda, and whether they're sort of the front organization for the ISI, people that are, you know, working with the militant groups. The Jundullah thing, to be honest, is one of the things that I was never able to really penetrate, but I would love to talk to you about that afterwards, because I think that there's a lot there. You know, and there's also two Jundullah organizations, right? There's one in Pakistan and Iran. And the Afia Siddiqui wedding.
Who is Afia Siddiqui?
Afia Siddiqui is, I forget the exact term, a neuroscientist who somehow became connected to Al Qaeda. She was living in Boston for a long period of time. She was on the FBI's radar screen. One summer they went to visit her, and then like by the next summer she was helping, and we go into some detail in the book about this, she was helping Majid Khan and other people that were in KSM's network of sort of American sleeper agents set up a beachhead in the United States through which they could mount attacks. And so she appears to have been very helpful to Al Qaeda, at least in the United States. She also, you know, as you know, allegedly married KSM's nephew, Ammar al-Baluchi. But, you know, I think that you know, even the people that I know that were in charge of investigating a lot of this stuff, I don't think they really know a lot of the answers to that. I had never heard that KSM had officiated at their wedding, but I do know that he was very closely connected to all of those people. You know, we have, in the book, we have that Majid Khan, who is now the guy who is going to be testifying against KSM, or one of the guys in Guantanamo, who spent a lot of time in Maryland, that he called KSM Chachi, which is uncle, you know, and that he was very close. And, you know, there's some information that we couldn't fit in the book about how much time and effort KSM spent in sort of grooming people like him and and radicalizing them and urging them to sort of come over to the jihadi side. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but I think that clearly KSM was in that sort of, that Afia Siddiqui knew KSM, certainly knew his nephew. Whether the marriage was a arranged marriage or something to help her once she joined the Al-Qaeda fold, I don't know. But maybe you do, so we can talk.
Great. Any other questions? I think we'll wrap it up then. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Josh, for a really interesting presentation. There are books here, and Josh will sign them.